Well, good morning and good afternoon, because I'm talking to Dr. Andrew Davis. He likes to be called Andrew. So I'm talking to Andrew, who is in England right now, where it's in the afternoon, and I'm talking to him from the heartland of the United States, here in St. Louis. So to me, it's 8:30 in the morning or 9 or so. And I'm very excited that Andrew has going to be willing to talk to us about a number of things around the issue of dyslexia, around the issue of how to teach reading, around the whole issue of synthetic phonics. We have a potpourri of things for him to talk about. But I'd like for him to start by talking about himself. So, Andrew, tell us just a bit about your background, and then we'll get into the talking points. So I'm going to turn it over to Andrew here. And thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Dr. Sam. It's so lovely to be here and to talk about oneself. What a lovely invitation. I might be saying a bit more than some of your contributors because of my unusual background, let's say. I was trained as an analytical philosopher, somebody who kind of spends their time dissecting concepts. And after I did that, I taught primary for some years, including most of my work was with the youngest age range. And I hope I taught quite a few children to read. But I certainly used phonics at the time. I was unaware then of the reading wars or different kinds of phonics, just phonics. I then returned to philosophy and did a PhD with a guy called Richard Swinburne, who those in the know is a very eminent philosopher of religion, and then got a job at Cambridge University, basically to do with philosophy of education and maths education, and that was great fun for some years. And then finally moved to Durham University, where I did the same kind of thing and eventually led the PGC primary course, which trains students in the UK to acquire qualified teaching status. And in all this time, my focus was on maths education and educational assessment. I didn't go near the topics of reading or dyslexia at all. And I published a lot in those areas. And then around 2010-11, I became aware of the reading wars, finally. I know this sounds extraordinary to those of you who are excessively familiar with them. And a great pressure in the UK on the use of synthetic phonics. And I didn't even know what that was, what kind of phonics it was. But I gradually began to find out. And eventually, and this you may feel is my fault, what happened, I wrote an academic article for an academic philosophy conference called A Monstrous Regimen of Synthetic Phonics, which I accept was a little bit provocative, but I thought this is just going to a group of philosophers in the holidays at Oxford University, and that was it. But somebody or some people got wind of this, and it came to the attention of an outfit in the UK called the Reading Reform Foundation. Whether you've heard of them in the States, I don't know. But they're full of passionate synthetic phonics adherents. And they began to attack me. And then I had defenders, and the whole thing blew up
into a reading war.
Yep, indeed, yeah. And then I was asked, in the light of this, to write a pamphlet in our Philosophy Society series, the Impact series, and it's this: to read or not to read, decoding synthetic phonics. The picture imaginatively shows a child confronted with the UK phonics check, which includes a lot of nonsense words, which they're meant to just decode. It tests their decoding skills. But the nonsense words, or pseudo words, as they're sometimes called, are flagged up by little pictures of monsters. So that's how this title came about. And I just got really, really confused about the whole debate. And then, as a philosopher does, began to hone in on some of the key ideas, concepts. The term a phoneme, which I know Dr. Sam would be very familiar with, but I had never heard of, and I investigated it. In the UK, at least, this may be true in the States as well, great play is made with the acronym GPCs, grapheme, phoneme correspondences. And when I read the literature about this, it seemed to me that it just was a synonym for letters, sounds, associations, correspondences. But then I read a little bit of linguistics and discovered that the phoneme is no such thing. It's not a sound. The technical word for sound is phone. Phonemes are abstract, I discovered. I hope that none of this is contestable, Dr. Sam. They serve to distinguish one word from another, and they're a class of sounds thought of in an abstract way. And sometimes phonemic differences in English, like s and sh, might not be phonemic, say, in Japanese. So in English, we might have the word sock, and if we change the first sound to sh and we get shock, we change the word. So the difference between s and sh is phonemic in English, but in Japanese it isn't. So this really confused me further in terms of the passionate adherence by some people to intensive and exclusive teaching of synthetic phonics. I thought, what on earth is going on here? And then I began to investigate the notion of a word and all sorts of other key ideas. And then, of course, reading itself. And it became clear to me that decoding, blending sounds, was part of learning to read, as was the other bit in the simple view of reading, which is often referred to as listening comprehension. The idea of the words you understand when you hear them in speech. So you have decoding, and you have your understanding of words you hear in speech, and in the end they combine to make reading. And this is exhibited in that lovely diagram of the Scarborough rope, which I know you all know about.
Oh, yes, quite familiar.
However, my investigations also showed that the Scarborough rope is inadequate in the sense that it shows decoding in one strand and kind of meaning and listening comprehension, whatever you want to call it, in the other strand. And they somehow are there separately, and then they combine to produce reading. And this, of course, is exhibited in the simple view of reading, where you have the two components, so to speak, multiplied together to produce reading. But in fact, this is not right, because decoding can never really be separated from the other bit. They're always combined together from the very start. So there's something oversimple about the so-called simple view of reading as well. So you can see there's a whole mass of conceptual investigations that I engaged in, to the fury and rage of some of our phonics adherents. One, perhaps I shouldn't name her, but one marketer,
Unnamed person. Okay.
a powerful phonics scheme in the UK, was asked to come to the book launch, and the editor of the series got a refusal from her and said she was comically apoplectic, which suggests we might be doing something right. And again, I have to emphasize this because this has happened to us. I am not, any more than you are, Dr. Sam, I think, against phonics. Of course not. I taught primary children to read, and I used phonics all over the place. What's worrying is a diet of very concentrated, intensive synthetic phonics imposed on all pupils. The worry is that you somehow feel any other way of getting meaning from text is illegitimate. You know, the classic example is we're not allowed to use pictures because that involves guessing and so on. So any approach to reading, for example, what's often referred to as multi-cueing, is despised. We mustn't have multi-cueing. We mustn't have decoding and looking at context and looking at the grammatical context and all that sort of thing. No, it's just got to be decoding for a while. So sometimes I'm described as wading into this field when I'm not an empirical researcher. I'm not an expert on the very detailed practice of teaching reading, although I did, as I've said, do this for many years. I'm a philosopher, and so I can only offer opinions, people say. But I think some of the conceptual dissection and pointing out of conceptual confusions is absolutely crucial here. And some of the conceptual confusion supports synthetic phonics adherence. The confusion, going back to the notion of phoneme, it's somehow blurs the difference between decoding thought of physically, acoustically, and the realm of meaning. And if you move the term phoneme out of its abstract place and make it almost a synonym of speech sounds or something like that, you blur this huge gulf between one and the other.
Okay, I'm having a bit of technical difficulty here. Hang on. There's what I'm after. Okay, what's now appearing on the screen are the two of us again, and this kind of is my cue that we've changed topics a bit. I'll just make a couple of comments on what you've said so far. First of all, boy, we should take a transcript of that and just turn that into a small article. Some really great. We are birds of a feather here, saying that the two processes have to be concurrent, and that my readers are quite familiar with the fact that I see Duke's work in adding to Scarborough's rope. And the concept of it being concurrent is important. And the other thing is that there are many systems of information that readers draw upon, not simply the sound symbol relations. And that on the one hand, there are definitely some children that need that kind of straight synthetic phonics. They definitely exist, and they need to be allowed to use that. But there are other kinds of children as well. I would have been one of them back in my day, that also need other things and should have access to them. Okay, so now that I'm off my soapbox, let's get back on to talking to you. There are endless repeated claims by phonics protagonists that children who don't decode text are just guessing. So could you give us a bit of a talk about that whole business of, well, is that really what we're doing, is teaching guessing? And I'll let you take it away.
Well, clearly the term guessing is quite an emotive one, and let's concede, any of us who've taught children to read, that some children do go through a phase of what is really not a good idea, and let's call that guessing if you like, making random stabs at things without looking properly at the page, at the text, at the context, at the pictures, if I'm allowed to say that. And they are merely guessing. But to say in general that children who are not explicitly decoding are guessing is to kind of try and hijack the very term reading and decide, on what authority I have no idea, that anything that doesn't explicitly involve decoding is guessing. Where do they get that authority from? Who says? Why can't a range of ways, as you just said, Dr. Sam, a range of ways of accessing the meaning of text, including, of course, decoding, are reading? It's a very emotive term, and the people who accuse those, for example, who favor multi-cueing or even whole language work as advocating guessing are simply hijacking the word. So I think
Okay, I'll add in my own 2 cents worth here. On the one hand, I call myself a centrist, which means at some points I've got to take stabs at both sides. Okay, and in this case, the balanced literacy folks, there are some of them that handled the whole issue of how to use the multi-cueing idea in such a way that they taught the children to overuse meaning, and underuse letter sounds. And when you use MSV or any kind of cueing system in that manner, that's not a good thing. And that's a practice that needs to change. So on the one hand, there's something to it, but I found that sometimes these folks oversimplify to the point, needing to change that particular practice is a very different thing than throwing it all out. Okay. And so I think we're birds of a feather here on that count. Okay. I think that, okay, I think that leads me right into a segue into the next talking point, which is, what about the simple view of reading? Is it valid? And I don't know if you're familiar with what Nell Duke did, which was basically add some things to that Scarborough's rope that included that emphasized reading a bit more. So, but what about the simple view of reading? Is it valid? Are there? What's your take on strengths, weaknesses, and what more? Where have they gone off the tracks completely? Just a little bit. Talk about this simple view of reading.
The simple view of reading talks, as many of you will know, about two components of reading: decoding or blending. In crude form, cat. You blend to make cat, and then somehow using the result of your decoding and mapping it on to what you've got in your head, so to speak, in terms of what you understand when you hear the word in speech. So the child who's produced cat then has already heard many times the word cat in speech and knows what it means. And so these two components are linked together. The simple view of reading uses a multiplication sign for some reason, I'm not quite sure why, to produce skilled reading. And in the UK, we had something called the Rose Report, which very much relied on the simple view of reading as though it was an empirical piece of research. And somehow it enabled the Rose Report and Jim Rose to isolate the skill of decoding and to talk about the necessity for teaching it and so on, as though it was separable from the other bit, the meaning bit. And I think this simple view of reading goes back to Guff and Tumner in the 1980s and so on. It's very, very influential, as I know you know. I'm not totally rejecting it, but I'm certainly have always thought, like many others, that it's oversimplified. And the huge oversimplification is to claim that the decoding bit can be thought of separately from the meaning bit, the listening comprehension bit. Whereas when you decode in English, often you cannot finish working out how to say the word without already ascending to the level of words and meanings. I mean, a very obvious case would be in the case of heteronyms. So if the child is reading the word TEAR in a sentence, which could be said as tear or as tear, the child must go to the level of meaning in order to decide which of the words she is dealing with. She begins to decode, and she might even have in her head, so to speak, tear or tear as a result of her decoding, but she cannot decide which to use without going to the level of meaning. So it's an obvious case of where decoding is a good start, but it cannot be completed. She can't even work out which word she's dealing with and then how to pronounce it without moving to the word of meaning. And English is full of examples like this. Heteronyms, where you actually emphasize syllables in a word, you often can't decide without ascending to the level of meaning. So a more advanced reader might encounter text which could be protest or protest, but you can't decide which pronunciation to choose unless you've gone to the level of meaning. So in short, the simple view of reading is too simple because it somehow encourages us to focus on each component separately when they're never really separate. Though, of course, in the UK phonics check, it artificially separates decoding in the bit of the phonics check which involves nonsense words that don't actually exist. And the child then can, out of context, just decode. But of course, that isn't really what reading is, or not what readers do. So it's a very strange thing to emphasize.
Okay.
Reading,
well, and I'll add my little bit in here. Just as a for instance, Nell Duke says that yes, indeed, they should work out the sound simple relation, but at some point in exactly the situations you're talking about, she calls it cross-checking that information with the meaning, and that's a step that is not some SOR people are not transparent about the need for that step. And I'll also add in my 2 cents worth, and this is a whole different interview and a whole set of things. But overall, I hate to put you on the spot, but we've been doing this synthetic phonics thing for well over 10 years. Correct me if I'm wrong. There in the British Isles and England and the rest. And has the miracle happened yet? What's the data around that? Are we still seeing that persistent group that? Well, I'll just put it that way. Has the miracle happened yet? Do you have any evidence that the miracle has happened? Because they certainly have had plenty of time to make it happen. So what's the situation over there?
I don't think it has happened. I'm not the best expert on empirical research, but I'm familiar with the, I've forgotten what the acronym stands for, PIRLS, International data about reading achievement in various countries. And a lot of play was made in recent years, particularly, I think, by our previous schools minister, Nick Gibb, about the fact that PRILS scores have gone up in the UK, and they may have done, but what he left out was an earlier bit of the chart before synthetic phonics ever started, when the UK was higher up still. so I don't.
Oh my!
I don't think the miracle has happened. Which is not to say that some synthetic phonics teaching has not done some children good. I mean, I'm not into kind of exaggerating the ills of one side or the other. It's, as you know, Dr. Sam, it's not like that. And when we talk about this, we can still even put ourselves into one of these tribes or categories if we're not careful. And I know neither of us want to be there, but people like to put you in a category and then they can shoot you down, don't they?
Absolutely. What a perfect segue into what I want to be the last. And you have written just any number of books. The one that intrigues me the most is the one where you were editor of a book where two folks kind of duked it out. That's not a proper term, around this whole issue. So I'd like to hear about that book and about any of the others that you'd like to make us aware of. And by the way, any book that you mentioned right now, there will be links to to getting that book. And I know some of them are yours. So if you would start with that book where you were the referee, well, not exactly, and take it from there.
It's a relatively short book, and I think it's called, I didn't revise my acquaintance with the title because it was written a little while ago, Dyslexia Developing the Debate. Is that the right title? I hope it is. And
I'll check in. If it isn't, the right title will be in the blog.
The two main protagonists are a guy called Professor Rod Nicholson, who's a professor of psychology at Sheffield University, UK. And he is keen on keeping the dyslexia label alive. He's passionately devoted to the cause of dyslexics, and of course, in particular, children who are suffering, if that's the right word, from dyslexia. And so he's on one side of the debate. And the other side of the debate in this book is Professor Julian or Joe Elliott, who a few years back fronted one or more television series with quite provocative titles like The Death of Dyslexia. And Joe has basically, he worked for many years as an educational psychologist, helping many, many pupils I know with their reading difficulties. And I know Joe was great. I know some people like to hate Ed Sykes, but I visited a special school in England with Joe, or was it more than one? And you know how staff of schools like that are unsung heroes, and probably some of them might not take too kindly to academics parachuting in and watching what they're doing, but they were just eating out of Joe's hands. So he was a good guy. He's on the right side of the saints, so to speak. Anyway, it's a debate between two, and my role was to look at what they were doing and some of the assumptions they were making about the nature of dyslexia and about their notions of social justice as well, because each of them were concerned with fairness about how we treat children who are finding difficulty in processing language and reading. And but I think broadly speaking, I came down, but not in the book actually, but just between us now, more on Joe's side of the equation. Joe wants all people experiencing difficulties in handling reading and language to have help, and often this needs expensive resources. Joe's worry, I think, among other people, is that a particular subgroup of people who genuinely need help claim to be suffering from dyslexia as though it's a specific condition, probably neurological in origin, which separates them from other people with difficulties and makes them, the sufferers from this specific difficulty called dyslexia, deserve special resources. And I don't think Joe or anybody else would say that they don't deserve special resources, but we're saying as a matter of social justice, it should be a wider range of people. And if Joe is forced to go on using the term dyslexia, he'd use it pragmatically to delineate a group who are poor in their processing capacities beyond a certain point. And these difficulties are very likely to be multi-caused. And the reason, of course, this is very important is, apart from the resource issue, if we're trying to help these children, it would be a terrible mistake if we thought wrongly that their difficulties were caused by a specific condition in the brain, for example, because then you might come up with a treatment for it. But if it's multi-caused, as I think dyslexia is, and Joe certainly thinks, in the sense of if difficulties are multi-caused, you need to go for multi-treatments. So that was that book. And I say I wasn't really an umpire, I was simply acting as a philosophical commentator. I'm described as the editor, but actually I've written a very substantial commentary at the back. Both protagonists claim to have learned from this, but we never know.
Okay. Well, actually, that last little segment that you talked through is such a perfect summary of where things are. And I'm thinking that I will absolutely have a link to that book. I know you've done several others, but I'm also looking at the clock. So what I think I will do is point out that you've got a free download on one called To Read or Not to Read. And I promised you, and this is okay, so that is available. And I promised you a chance. As you know, I sometimes teach writing workshop, and I'm also always interested in talking to children of authors of children's books. And my gosh, could it be that you are one of those?
Well, this is a work of science fiction for young adults. Well, I'm hoping anybody would enjoy reading it. It has little to do with phonics, but it is a new venture, and I've now just finished a second one, but I won't say any more about that at the moment because I'm not. The publisher might want it, but I think they're not totally sure. Anyway, this is great fun, all about artificial intelligence and how they might be treated in the future. That is, by they, I mean AIs who have become almost more intelligent and emotionally compassionate than human beings.
Oh
So
my.
And
I must warn you, I have an Alexa in the room, and I think she's listening in. Oops. So, okay, but that was really a little off the charts there. I think that we could certainly go on and on, but I think we've reached that point where I have to ask, any final thoughts on the topic before we close things out?
All I can say, Dr. Sam, it has been very enjoyable and very fascinating to talk to you about this. I hope some of my burblings make sense to you and to other viewers and listeners. because I'm, in a sense, an outsider. I know you talked a lot of international reading experts, and I'm a mere philosopher coming in and
Well,
dissecting concepts.
you're more than mere. Thank you very much.
But thank you again for asking. It's been a great pleasure.
Okay, and there's one final tradition that all people that have watched my interviews know about, and that is the interviewee and myself give everyone a Zoom wave goodbye. So if you could just smile away, and thank you so much. And signing off, and you're signing off there from England. And here we go. Bye-bye.